On August 14th, 2011, a $60,000 fine from the Environmental Protection Agency against a farmer named Silas Miller evaporated. It wasn't negotiated down in a windowless room by lawyers in suits. It wasn't appealed through years of costly litigation. It didn't become a political rallying cry on talk radio. It simply ceased to exist, erased from the federal ledger as if it had been a clerical error. And it ceased to exist because of a single piece of brittle, yellowed paper drawn 63 years earlier, folded into a 4-inch square and kept in a dented tin box with his grandfather's property deeds. The paper was a map. To understand how a map drawn with India ink and a draftsman's pen could defeat a federal agency armed with satellite imagery and the full force of the Clean Water Act, you have to understand the land it depicted. And you have to understand the man who had refused to pay the fine. Silas Miller was 68 years old in the summer of 2011. He had been farming the same 482 acres in Blackwood County, Iowa, for 51 of those years. He had taken over the land from his father Thomas, who had taken it over from his father John, who had bought the first 160-acre parcel in 1903 for $45 an acre from a railroad speculator who had never seen it. Silas was a man known for 3 things: the straightness of his cornrows, his refusal to speak more than 20 words when 10 would do, and a quiet, unshakable belief that he knew his land better than any man or government alive. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, and years of lifting feed sacks and wrestling with machinery had given his torso the dense, immovable quality of an oak stump. His hands were maps of their own, the lines of his palms deepened by work, and the backs of them dotted with the pale scars of 1,000 minor injuries. He wore the same thing most days: warm blue jeans held up by a plain leather belt, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and steel-toed boots caked with the soil he worked. The soil was a Clarion Nicollet Webster association, mostly glacial till, dark and heavy and capable of astonishing fertility if you knew its moods. Silas knew its moods. The Miller farm was not a picturesque hobby farm. It was a working operation, a business with thin margins and relentless demands. It sat 3 miles down a gravel road named for his family, Miller Road, and was bordered on the north by a stand of bur oak, and on the south by what the government had decided to call Clear Creek Tributary B. To Silas and to his father and grandfather before him, it was just the ditch. It was a seasonal waterway, a shallow depression in the landscape that ran with water for 2 months in the spring during the thaw and for a few days after a heavy summer rain. For the rest of the year, it was a damp, grassy swale, home to cattails and red-winged blackbirds. Every 5 or 6 years, Silas would take his old John Deere 4020 tractor, the one he bought used in 1978, and clean out the accumulated silt and debris from the ditch. It was basic maintenance, like cleaning the gutters on a house. The water needed to flow freely during the spring melt. If it didn't, it would back up and saturate the 40 acres of his best corn ground, delaying planting by 2 weeks and cutting his yield by 30%. He had done it that year in late March, spending a Saturday clearing a 300-yard stretch where the cattails had grown too thick. He'd piled the dredged soil on the bank, just as his father had taught him, so the next good rain would wash the good topsoil back onto the field where it belonged. He hadn't thought a thing of it. It was a chore, nothing more. The letter arrived on May 12, 2011. It was from the Region 7 office of the Environmental Protection Agency in Kansas City. It was 7 pages long, dense with legal boilerplate, but the message was brutally simple. An anonymous complaint, substantiated by aerial and satellite photography, had led to the discovery of a violation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act of 1972. Specifically, the discharging of dredged and fill material into the waters of the United States without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The letter identified the waterway as Clear Creek Tributary B. It included satellite photos from before and after his work, showing the clean line of the cleared ditch and the dark pile of soil on its bank. It concluded with a proposed penalty, a fine of $60,000, payable within 30 days. Silas read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. His grandfather had built from a black walnut tree cleared from the property in 1922. His wife Mary watched him. She knew his silences. This was a deep one.
After the 3rd reading, he folded the letter, creasing it precisely along its original folds, and put it back in the envelope. He looked out the window at the fields, green with the promise of that year's crop. He said, to no one in particular, "They've lost their minds." Let me tell you about the Clean Water Act, because to understand Silas's position, you have to understand the law he was accused of breaking. Passed in 1972, its stated objective was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. It was a landmark piece of legislation, responsible for cleaning up rivers that had once been open sewers. Its authority rested on the simple, powerful phrase, "Waters of the United States." The problem was, nobody could quite agree on what that phrase meant. Did it mean only navigable rivers, the kind you could float a barge on? Did it include the streams that flowed into those rivers? What about the smaller creeks that fed the streams?
What about the intermittent drainages that only flowed a few weeks a year, but eventually, miles downstream, connected to the larger system? For 40 years, the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Supreme Court had wrestled with that definition. By 2011, the prevailing interpretation, the one used by the agent who wrote Silas's letter, was broad. It relied on the concept of a significant nexus. If a waterway, even a small temporary one, had a significant connection to a larger navigable body of water, it could be considered a water of the United States and fall under federal jurisdiction. The man from the EPA who believed Silas Miller's ditch had that significant nexus was named Mark Renslow. He was 32 years old, had a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Michigan, and had been with the agency for 4 years. He was earnest, intelligent, and a firm believer in the importance of his work. He saw the world through the lens of systems, watersheds, ecosystems, regulatory frameworks. To him, the environment was an interconnected whole, and the rules were there to protect it from the uncoordinated actions of individuals. He was the confident outsider. He wasn't a villain. He was a professional doing his job as he understood it. He drove out to the Miller farm a week after the letter arrived, at the request of Silas's son, Daniel. Daniel Miller was 44, a graduate of Iowa State with a degree in agronomy. He farmed alongside his father, but he represented the next generation. He used GPS for planting, analysed yield data on a laptop, and read the trade journals. He understood that the world was more complicated than it had been in his father's youth. He saw the letter not as an absurdity, but as a problem to be managed. He called the number on the letterhead and arranged the meeting, hoping for a reasonable conversation that could lead to a reduction in the fine.
He was the young inheritor, caught between the old world and the new. Renslow arrived in a white Ford sedan with government plates. He wore hiking boots, khaki pants, and a polo shirt with an EPA logo embroidered on the chest. He carried a clipboard and a GPS unit. Daniel met him in the driveway. Silas stayed on the porch watching. "Mr. Miller," Renslow said to Daniel, extending a hand. "Thanks for seeing me. I'm Mark Renslow." "Daniel Miller, my father Silas is over there." Silas gave a slight nod. He did not move from the porch. "I just wanted to walk the area in question," Renslow said, his tone polite and professional. "Confirm our findings and discuss a path forward." Daniel led him out behind the barn to the edge of the field that bordered the ditch. Silas followed 10 paces behind, his arms crossed over his chest. Renslow walked along the bank, looking at the cleared channel. He took a few pictures with a digital camera. He made a note on his clipboard.
So you can see here, Renslow began, turning to face them, the soil was excavated from the stream bed and deposited on the bank.
This is a classic dredge and fill action, and because this tributary connects to Clear Creek about 2 miles downstream, which in turn flows into the Raccoon River, it falls under federal jurisdiction. We have maps showing the hydrological connection. Daniel nodded, trying to be cooperative. We understand. My father's been clearing this for 50 years. His father did it before him. It's just routine maintenance to make sure the field drains properly. I appreciate that, Renslow said, and the rules have changed over the years. But under the current interpretation of the law, an activity like this requires a permit. The goal is to prevent sediment and potential pollutants from entering the watershed. It was then that Silas spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, not with anger, but with a profound, settled certainty. "That's not a creek," he said.
Renslow turned to him. Sir, our maps and hydrological models classify this as an intermittent stream. It's part of the watershed. It's a drainage ditch, Silas repeated. My granddad and his neighbors dug the main channel of it with mules and a slip scraper in 1924 because this whole section was a swamp. Renslow gave a small, patient smile. Well, that may be, but over time a man-made ditch can become naturalized and develops the features of a stream, a bed, a bank, an ordinary high water mark. Legally, it becomes a tributary. The law is wrong, Silas said. It was not a challenge, it was a statement of fact. The law is the law, Renslow replied, his professional patience wearing thin. He looked at Daniel. Look, we can talk about mitigation, a restoration plan, a reduced penalty, but the violation is clear. The agency has to enforce the statute. The conversation was over. Daniel walked Renslow back to his car, talking about options and appeals. Silas remained by the ditch. He looked at the water, which was barely a trickle now in the late spring heat. He looked at the dark earth he had piled on the bank. He looked at the field of corn, now 6 inches high, its leaves a vibrant, perfect green. He had worked this land his entire life. He had nurtured it, protected it, made it productive. The idea that a 32-year-old with a clipboard and a map from a distant office could tell him he was harming it was more than an insult. It was a fiction, a dangerous fiction. He was not going to pay $60,000 to validate a fiction. The story of the fine spread through the county. Farmers would stop Silas at the co-op or after church. They'd shake their heads. They'd tell him about their own run-ins with government agencies, their own frustrations with rules that seemed to have no connection to the reality of the land. His fight became their fight. A town hall meeting was organized at the county fairgrounds. The local farm bureau invited a representative from the EPA to explain the agency's position on the Waters of the United States rule. The EPA sent Mark Renslow. Let me tell you about the room that night. It was the main exhibition hall, a cavernous space that smelled of sawdust and livestock. 300 people were there, mostly farmers and their families, sitting in folding chairs. They were not activists. They were not radicals. They were conservatives in the truest sense of the word. They wanted to conserve a way of life that was becoming harder to maintain with each passing year. They saw the federal government not as a protector, but as an adversary that was constantly moving the goalposts, changing the rules, and making it impossible to plan for the future. They were the community witnesses. Renslow stood at a podium at the front of the room. He had a PowerPoint presentation. He showed slides with diagrams of watersheds, charts of nutrient loads, and legal definitions from the Federal Register. He spoke calmly and rationally, explaining the science and the law. He believed what he was saying. He believed he was on the side of the angels, protecting the environment for future generations. The key concept, he explained, pointing to a complex diagram on the screen, is the significant nexus. We have to look at the entire system. Actions taken in a small upstream tributary can have significant effects on the water quality of a major river miles downstream. That is why the Act grants the agency jurisdiction over these smaller bodies of water. A farmer in the third row stood up. He was a hog farmer named Bill Jensen.
I've got a ditch that runs through my pasture. It's dry 8 months of the year. Are you telling me I need a federal permit to fix a piece of broken tile line near that ditch? If the activity involves discharging material into the ditch and that ditch has a significant nexus to a navigable waterway, then yes, technically a permit would be required, Renslow said. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a low, unhappy sound. They weren't just hearing about Silas Miller's problem anymore. They were hearing about their own. Every farm had a dozen such ditches, swales, and grass waterways. The presentation was turning a specific dispute into a universal threat. Silas was there, sitting in the back with Daniel. He didn't speak. He just listened. He watched the faces of his neighbors. He saw their anxiety, their anger. He had not asked for this fight, but it was here.
As he sat there, listening to the language of hydrology and legal precedent, a memory surfaced. It was a vague recollection of his father, Thomas, talking about the big dig after the Great Flood. Something about a new drainage district, about maps and assessments. He remembered his father complaining about having to pay a special tax for it, a tax that was supposed to guarantee their fields would never flood like that again. When they got home that night, Silas didn't go to bed. He went to the small office off the living room where he kept his records. Daniel followed him. "What are you looking for, Dad?" "Something of your grandfather's," Silas said. He was rummaging through the bottom drawer of a heavy oak filing cabinet. He pulled out a dark green tin box, about the size of a shoebox. It was dented and the paint was chipped. On the lid, in faded white letters, were the words, "John Miller, Property." He put the box on the desk and lifted the hinged lid.
The air filled with the dry, dusty smell of old paper. Inside were decades of documents, deeds, abstracts of title, mortgage notes stamped paid, survey records. He carefully lifted them out one by one, and there, at the very bottom, was a folded bundle of papers wrapped in twine. He untied the twine. Inside was a linen-backed document folded into a tight square. It was heavy and stiff. He carefully unfolded it on the desk. Daniel leaned in closer. It was a map, a plat map of a section of Blackwood County. It was beautifully drawn in black and red ink. The lettering was elegant, done by a skilled hand. In the bottom right corner was a title block. Official Plat of Blackwood County Drainage District Number 7, it read. Commissioned by the Board of Supervisors, May 10th, 1948. G. L. Henderson, County Surveyor. The map showed the farms, the property lines, the roads, and running through it all, marked in a bold red line, was a network of channels. Each channel was labelled.
The main channel was Judicial Ditch A. The smaller, connecting channels were numbered. Silas ran his finger across the map, tracing the lines through the familiar shapes of his neighbours' farms. He found his own property, and there, running along its southern border, was a red line. Next to the line, in precise, clear letters, was a label. It did not say Clear Creek Tributary B. It said Drainage Ditch Number 7. Let me tell you about the Great Flood of 1947. Because to understand the map, you have to understand the water that made it necessary. In the spring of 1947, after a winter of record snowfall, the rains came. It rained for 11 straight days in late May. The Raccoon River and all its tributaries swelled beyond their banks. The flat, fertile landscape of Blackwood County turned into a vast, shallow lake. John Miller, Silas's grandfather, lost his entire crop that year. The water stood in his best fields until mid-July. The disaster spurred the county into action.
The farmers knew they couldn't control the rain, but they could control where the water went. They petitioned the County Board of Supervisors to form a drainage district, a legal entity with the power to levy taxes and undertake public works projects. In 1948, the newly formed Blackwood County Drainage District No. 7 undertook a massive earth-moving project. Using draglines and mules, they deepened and straightened the existing creeks and dug miles of new ditches, creating a rational, engineered system to carry excess water away quickly. It was a triumph of community self-reliance. G. L. Henderson, the county surveyor, drew the official map to document the new system. This map was not just a picture, it was a legal document. It was filed with the county recorder. It was the basis for the special tax assessments each farmer paid to fund the project. It was the county's official declaration that these channels were not natural streams, but man-made infrastructure, built for the specific purpose of agricultural drainage. The map Silas held in his hands was his grandfather's personal copy, a record of the promise the community had made to itself. Silas and Daniel looked at the map, then at each other. Daniel was the first to grasp the legal significance. He had heard lawyers talk about the nuances of the Clean Water Act. He knew there was a long-running debate about whether man-made ditches fell under its jurisdiction. "Dad," he said, his voice hushed with excitement, "this could be it. This is an official government document. It designates that ditch as a man-made facility." Silas just nodded. He ran his calloused finger over the words, "Drainage Ditch No. 7." It was the truth. It had been the truth for 63 years. He had known it in his bones, in the stories his father told, in the very shape of the land. But he hadn't had the proof.
Now he did. The next morning, Daniel called the EPA office in Kansas City. He didn't ask for Mark Renslow. He asked to speak to Renslow's supervisor, a woman named Catherine Beale. He explained that he had new information regarding his father's case. An appointment was made for the following week. Silas insisted on going. He wore his Sunday clothes, a starched white shirt and his best trousers. He refused to let Daniel carry the tin box. He held it on his lap for the entire 3-hour drive to Kansas City. They walked into the Federal Building, a modern tower of glass and steel that seemed a world away from the farm. They rode a silent elevator to the 15th floor. The EPA offices were quiet, a maze of gray cubicles. Catherine Beale was a woman in her late 50s, with short gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had been with the agency for 25 years. She was a lawyer by training. Mark Renslow was in the meeting with her, looking uncomfortable. They sat at a large conference table.
"Mr. Miller," Beale began, "your son indicated you have some new information for us." Silas didn't say a word. He placed the tin box on the polished surface of the table. He opened it and took out the map. He unfolded it and pushed it across the table. Beale and Renslow leaned forward. They looked at the map. Beale, the lawyer, went straight for the title block. She read the date, the name of the surveyor, the designation as an official plat of a county drainage district. Renslow traced the red line of ditch No. 7 with his finger, comparing it to the satellite photos in his file. They were clearly the same waterway. Beale was silent for a full minute studying the document. She picked it up, feeling the texture of the old linen backing. She looked at the crispness of the 63-year-old ink. This was not a forgery. This was an authentic historical document. "Under the regulations," she said, thinking aloud more than speaking to them, "there is an exemption for waste treatment systems, but the more relevant precedent relates to the Corps of Engineers' guidance on ditches. A ditch excavated wholly in uplands for agricultural purposes that does not divert or relocate a natural stream may not be considered a jurisdictional water." She looked at Renslow. "What's the history on this tributary?" "Our records classify it as a natural intermittent stream, ma'am," Renslow said, his voice strained. "The data we have shows it following a historic watercourse." "This map says otherwise," Beale said flatly. She looked back at Silas. This is an official county document filed in 1948. Yes, ma'am, Daniel said. We can get a certified copy from the Blackwood County Recorder's Office. That won't be necessary, Beale said.
She tapped the map with her pen.
This predates the Clean Water Act by 24 years. It establishes the legal character of the waterway as a man-made drainage facility at the time of its construction. It was never a natural stream that was relocated. It was a ditch built to drain wetlands. She looked at Renslow. Our maps are wrong. Our classification is wrong. She folded the map carefully and slid it back across the table to Silas. She looked him in the eye. The violation is withdrawn. That was it. No apology, no admission of a larger error, just a quiet bureaucratic surrender to an undeniable fact. The $60,000 fine was gone. The weight that had been pressing on the Miller family and on their entire community had been lifted. The drive home was quiet. Silas held a tin box on his lap. Daniel drove, glancing over at his father from time to time. He saw not triumph in his father's face, but a deep, weary satisfaction. He was seeing his father in a new light.
He had always seen him as a man of the earth, of intuition and tradition.
He had seen himself as the one who understood the modern world of data and regulations. But he had been wrong. His father's knowledge wasn't just intuition. It was a deep, layered understanding of history, of promises made and contracts signed, of the land's legal identity as well as its physical one. The inherited object, the map in the tin box, was not a relic. It was a weapon. It was a truth. The story of the map became a local legend. Farmers from 3 counties over came to the Miller farm to see it. Daniel spent hours at the county courthouse making copies of the 1948 Drainage District Plat for other farmers who had ditches on their property that were now being called creeks. The map didn't solve every problem, but it created a powerful precedent. It armed the community with its own history. It proved that the official record was not always the one on a federal agency's computer.
Sometimes it was in a tin box in a farmhouse. Mark Renslow was transferred to a desk job in the Denver office 6 months later. He never worked in enforcement again. He had done his job by the book, but the book had been incomplete. He had trusted the data, and the data had been wrong. His confidence had been based on a knowledge that was wide but shallow. He had encountered a knowledge that was narrow but deep as the black soil of the Miller farm, and his system had broken against it. In the years that followed, Daniel took over more of the farm's operation. He still used GPS and analysed yield data, but he did so with a new humility. He spent long hours with his father, not just learning how to farm, but learning the history of every acre. He learned the story of the fence line that had been moved after a property dispute in the 1930s, the story of the low spot in the west field that had once been a buffalo wallow, the story of the day his grandfather had brought home the tin box with the map in it. He learned that the farm was not just a collection of assets and production units. It was a repository of memory. Silas Miller lived for another 12 years. He farmed until he was 75, then reluctantly handed the reins to Daniel. He never stopped walking the land. In his last years, he would often walk the bank of drainage ditch number 7. He would watch the red-winged blackbirds sway on the cattails and listen to the gurgle of the water in the spring. He had not fought the EPA for money or for pride. He had fought for the right to call a thing by its true name. When he died at the age of 80, the whole county came to his funeral. The church was overflowing. After the service, people gathered at the farm. They ate and they told stories. Daniel brought out the tin box and set it on the old walnut kitchen table. He opened it and showed the map to his own children. He told them the story of the fine, of the man from the government, and of how their grandfather had protected the farm with a piece of paper. He was passing on the inheritance. Not just the land, but the knowledge that came with it. The knowledge that true authority comes not from a distant office, but from a long and intimate relationship with a particular place.
Institutional memory is kept in databases on servers cooled by humming fans. Family memory is kept in tin boxes in the attics of old houses. One is vast, searchable, and updated constantly. It is confident in its own accuracy. The other is small, specific, and folded into brittle squares. It sleeps for decades at a time. The world runs on the database. It trusts the satellite image, the hydrological model, the official designation.
But the land remembers the tin box. And sometimes, when the database is wrong, the tin box is the only thing that can set the record straight.